Hey, what's going on? It's Dr. Mike T. Nelson here, and today we're doing a short primer on heart rate variability. So why do you want to measure HRV? It's a way to determine what level of stress you are under. Now, everyone talks a lot about stress, and for good reason, but the old Peter Drucker comment, what gets measured gets managed. And having an easy way to measure stress, I think, is useful. Now, there's lots of ways that you can measure stress. It just depends on what type of stress. We could measure heart rate, which gives us some idea of cardiac stress or strain, and even how much stress is on your body as a whole. We could measure things like breathing. We could do rate or volume, if we use just simple terms. We could measure air exchange, right? So I have a very expensive metabolic cart where we can hook you up. We can look at how much oxygen and CO2 you are using. This gives us some idea of what sources, fats versus carbohydrates, what fuel you are using during that time. As you become more stressed, classically, let's say with exercise, you're going to have a shift from the use of fat to more carbohydrates are going to be used. Right? So as you exercise more, CO2 is going to go up as a byproduct, not really a waste product. I'm changing my terminology on that because CO2 has lots of super important signaling effects and other effects on the body. So heart rate variability is if we take heart rate, we measure something what's called the R to R intervals. So if you've seen the little EKG, you got the little big R wave here. That's a horrible looking EKG. Looks like he's having a cardiac event. But so the big R wave, the big peaky one here, right? Your QRS complex to the next R wave, that's going to tell us our heart rate. And this distance is just a distance on your old EKG paper here. So we have these R to R intervals. Now we're going to measure them really, really close, within a few milliseconds. And instead of doing an average, right, so the average gives us our average heart rate, we're going to do something called a variability analysis. And I'm not going to go into all the different crazy math that can be used in that, but it's just looking to see how different is this one RR interval from the next one, from the next one, from the next one, right? So it's a variability analysis, not necessarily an average. So what we're looking at is very, very fine scale variability. So how much do these things change within a few milliseconds from one beat to the next? If we translate this into beats per minute, which is how most people think about heart rate, if you're just sitting here watching this video, let's say you're at 65.7, your next heart rate is 66.3, 64.5, 66.9. Right? Let's compare you to our fictitious Bob here. So Bob's at 65.5. 65.4, 66.0, 65.6. Now, without doing any fancy math, just by looking at these numbers here, you can see that, let's say you are much better in variability than Bob. So Bob just really doesn't change a whole lot. So Bob has a decrease in fine scale variability, even though we could set up these numbers so that the average comes out to about the same. They may or may not in this case. Right, so just by looking at that, we can see that even if our average comes to be the same, the variability, there's differences between these numbers. And so heart rate variability is a variability analysis of that. So why does that matter? So heart rate variability is a good proxy for something called the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system has two branches. One of them is the parasympathetic branch, and this is like the brake on your car. If you push down on the brake harder, your heart rate will slow down, right? Your car will slow down. The other one is the sympathetic side. So the sympathetic side is like your gas pedal. Push harder on the gas pedal, your heart rate is going to go up. So the autonomic nervous system in humans has two branches, parasympathetic and the sympathetic. So heart rate variability tells us the status of these two branches. In essence, how stressed are you? Are you much more on the parasympathetic side, which is more braking, reducing heart rate? A lot of times this is, you'll say, more relaxing. Or are you on more of the sympathetic side, the gas pedal, things that are increasing heart rate, right? Your typical stress response, fight, flight, those types of things. So heart rate variability is telling us a status of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system has the parasympathetic branch, which slows heart rate, the sympathetic branch that speeds up heart rate. HRV will be able to tell us how stressed you are by looking at the variability, and that tells us the amount of parasympathetic versus the sympathetic side. How this is done is there's a fair amount of apps that can be used for this. I like using the iThlete app, but there are other devices. You can look at an Oura Ring. Watches will generally kind of do that now too. Again, you want to make sure that this is a valid measurement. So I always like to look at the research to see what's going on for that to make sure that it is a valid system that is being used. There's pros and cons of each one. But generally you're going to do it first thing in the morning. Most people are going to be in a seated position. Going to rest for about 1 to 2 minutes, and then you will, for example, use your app, and that will give you a heart rate variability score. So a lot of them will translate that into, say, like a 1 to 100 scale. So for example, on the iThlete scale, the higher the number you are, the more parasympathetic you are. So the more relaxed you are. Right? The lower the number is more on the sympathetic side. So if you wanted to know what's going on with heart rate variability, more parasympathetic tone is associated with more fine scale variability. As you start losing fine scale variability, you become more sympathetic. And by documenting this, usually you'll have some other type of context you can enter. How was your self-report of sleep, energy, things of that nature. Now you can log these over time, which is great because that allows you to see not only where you're at for that day, but you can see trends. You can look to see how does your training affect it. How does even things like related to emotions affect it, right? How does nutrition relate to it? And it's a good way of taking, just a few minutes, total time. Maybe you're looking at 3 to 5 minutes once per day to get an idea of what is your stress level. Again, like the Peter Drucker quote, what gets measured gets managed. Now you have an idea of where your autonomic nervous system is at on a daily basis. If you're using this, let's say, for training, maybe you opt to measure your HRV in the morning, and let's say it's really crappy for some reason, right? So very low HRV, you're very much on the sympathetic end of the spectrum. You could decide to maybe take a little bit more of a rest day. Generally with clients, maybe cut their volume by 50%. There's other things that you can do. So I find this super useful. I've been using this online with clients now for about 8+ years. I did research in heart rate variability as part of my PhD starting, oh man, probably about 13 years ago. And I find it extremely useful, especially with online clients, because I don't get to watch them move. I don't really know necessarily what's going on other than what they report. So again, having a marker of stress is super useful. So we can play around with things like maybe gradually increasing their training volume, and we'll maybe look to see what happens with their HRV. We know other types of training, so especially if you do more aerobic training, again, if it's not super high intensity, and generally that will increase heart rate variability. That makes you more parasympathetic over time, right? Not necessarily measuring it right after, but over time. This is also related to your VO2 max. We can look at even nutrition things. Things like fish oil, micronutrition is related to heart rate variability. So at the end of the day, what HRV is telling us is HRV is a marker of the acute stress that is on your nervous system at that time, or what's called your autonomic nervous system. And by measuring that over time, that allows us to look at different trends, and that allows you to see how your actual physiology, how is it responding in time, because everyone's going to respond a little bit different. And this gives you some idea of where you're at in addition to how you feel. So you get both qualitative and a quantitative feel and thoughts and data for your stress level. So that's a very short, less than 12-minute summary of maybe the past 13 years or so of my life looking at heart rate variability. If you have any more questions on that, let me know. But overall, I do find it is a very useful tool.